Standing in the marble lobby of the courthouse at 8:45 on a Tuesday morning, I clutched the worn leather briefcase that had once belonged to my grandmother, Thessaly Ravencrest. The weight of it felt heavier than the documents inside, heavier even than the 3 years of legal battles that had brought me to this moment. Through the tall windows, morning light cast long shadows across the polished floor, and I found myself thinking about the last conversation I had had with grandmother before she died, when she'd pressed this same briefcase into my hands and whispered words that had haunted me ever since. "Cordelia," she'd said, her voice barely audible above the hum of hospital machines, "there are things about our family that I never told you, things about your mother that you deserve to know, but only when you're strong enough to hear them." I'd been 28 then, already running Ravencrest Textiles for 2 years under her guidance, already proving myself capable of handling the intricate relationships with suppliers and customers that kept our family business thriving. I thought I was strong enough for anything. Now, at 31, with 3 years of legal warfare behind me, I wasn't so certain. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and my attorney, Maximiliana Thornfield, emerged carrying her own briefcase and wearing the expression she reserved for particularly challenging cases. Max had been grandmother's lawyer for over 2 decades, and when I'd inherited not just the company, but also the burden of defending it, she'd become mine as well. "Ready for this, Cordelia?" she asked, her voice carrying that blend of confidence and concern that had become familiar over our months of preparation. I nodded, though ready felt like an overstatement. How could anyone be ready to face the woman who'd walked out of their life at age 7, only to return at 31 with a team of aggressive lawyers and claims that everything I'd built, everything grandmother had left me, rightfully belonged to her? Seraphina Ravencrest, my mother, had been absent from my life for 24 years. 24 years of birthday cards never sent, Christmas mornings spent wondering why I wasn't enough to make her stay, graduations she'd missed, achievements she'd never celebrated. When grandmother died and left me everything, the textile company, the family estate, the investments and properties accumulated over generations, I'd assumed that chapter of abandonment was finally closed. I'd been naive. The lawsuit arrived 6 weeks after the funeral, delivered by a process server who'd found me in grandmother's garden, tending to the roses she'd loved so much. The papers had been thick with legal terminology, but the message was clear enough. Seraphina Ravencrest was challenging the will, claiming undue influence, mental incapacity, and fraud. She wanted everything: the company I'd been running successfully for 5 years, the house where I'd lived since childhood, even the personal savings grandmother had accumulated through decades of careful financial planning. The irony wasn't lost on me. The daughter who'd been absent for nearly a quarter-century was now demanding the inheritance that had been carefully cultivated by the grandmother who'd actually raised me. "She's here," Max murmured, nodding toward the far end of the lobby. I turned and saw her for the first time in 24 years. Seraphina Ravencrest moved through the courthouse lobby with the kind of confident stride that suggested she belonged there, that she had every right to be fighting for assets she'd never shown interest in, while the woman who'd earned them was alive. She was 53 now, her dark hair silvered at the temples, her face bearing the kind of elegant bone structure that had made her a successful model in her 20s, before she'd married my father and briefly attempted domestic life. She wore a navy blue suit that probably cost more than most people spent on their monthly mortgage, and she was flanked by two attorneys I recognized from their previous correspondence, expensive lawyers from a prestigious firm that specialized in inheritance disputes. The kind of legal representation that suggested she was serious about this fight and had the resources to sustain it. Our eyes met across the crowded lobby, and for a moment I saw something flicker in her expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of how much I'd changed since she'd last seen me. I'd been a 7-year-old with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile when she'd packed her bags and informed my father she wasn't cut out for motherhood. Now I stood there as a grown woman who'd built something meaningful from the foundation she'd abandoned. She sighed dramatically, loud enough for people around her to notice, and I caught the calculated nature of it. This wasn't genuine emotion, it was performance. Even after all these years, even in a courthouse where the future of our family legacy would be determined, she was still performing. Max touched my elbow gently. Don't let her get under your skin. That's exactly what she wants. But it was too late for that advice. Serafina had been under my skin for 24 years, a constant presence through her very absence. Every decision I'd made, every achievement I'd earned, every moment I'd proven myself capable and worthy, all of it had been shadowed by the question of why I hadn't been enough to make my own mother stay. We made our way to the courtroom, joining the small crowd of people waiting outside the heavy wooden doors. I recognized some faces from the textile industry, competitors and colleagues who were undoubtedly curious about the outcome of this very public family dispute. Others were strangers, perhaps other litigants, waiting for their own hearings, but their presence still added to the weight of the moment. Judge Erasmus Blackthorne, Max said quietly, reviewing her notes one final time. He's been on the bench for 15 years, specializes in probate and estate law. Fair, thorough, not easily swayed by emotional appeals. This is exactly the kind of case he handles well. I'd researched Judge Blackthorne extensively during our preparation. His rulings tended to favor clear evidence over dramatic presentations, legal precedent over sob stories. That should have been reassuring, given that we had documentation spanning 5 years of my successful management of Ravencrest textiles, along with grandmother's meticulously kept records showing her deliberate and careful decision-making process regarding the inheritance. But Serafina's legal team had been busy too. They'd gathered their own evidence, medical records suggesting grandmother might have been experiencing early cognitive decline, testimony from distant relatives claiming I'd isolated her from family, financial records they'd managed to obtain showing the exact extent of what I'd inherited. Their case was built on the suggestion that a vulnerable elderly woman had been manipulated by an opportunistic granddaughter. The accusation stung not just because it was false, but because it perverted the truth of my relationship with grandmother. I'd lived with her since childhood, not because I was manipulating her, but because my mother had abandoned us both. I'd worked in the family business not to position myself for inheritance, but because it was meaningful work that connected me to generations of Ravencrest women who'd built something lasting. I'd cared for grandmother in her final years, not for financial gain, but because she was the only real family I'd ever known. The courtroom doors opened, and we filed inside. The space was more intimate than I'd expected, with dark wood paneling and high windows that let in streams of morning light. The judge's bench dominated the front of the room, flanked by flags and legal texts that spoke to the weight of the decisions made within these walls. Serafina and her legal team took their seats at the plaintiff's table, spreading out documents and computer tablets with the kind of organized efficiency that suggested they'd done this before. Max and I settled at the defendant's table, and I found myself studying the back of my mother's head, trying to reconcile this polished stranger with the woman who'd once read me bedtime stories and taught me to braid friendship bracelets. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Erasmus Blackthorne," the bailiff announced. We stood as one, the rustle of clothing and shuffling of papers filling the courtroom. Then the side door opened, and Judge Blackthorne emerged from his chambers. He was a tall man, in his early 60s, with gray hair and the kind of measured movements that suggested careful consideration of every action. He took a seat behind the bench, adjusted his glasses, and began reviewing the case files in front of him. "Please be seated," he said, his voice carrying easily through the courtroom. "We're here today for the matter of Ravencrest versus Ravencrest, regarding the estate of Thessaly Ravencrest. This is a probate challenge filed by Serafina Ravencrest against the current beneficiary, Cordelia Ravencrest." He looked up from his papers, scanning the courtroom to orient himself to the parties involved. His gaze moved first to Serafina's table, where her lead attorney was making final adjustments to his notes. Then his eyes shifted to our table, settling first on Max before moving to me. The moment his gaze found my face, everything changed. Judge Blackthorne went completely still, his expression shifting from professional neutrality to something I couldn't quite identify. Recognition, perhaps, or shock. His eyes widened slightly, and he leaned forward in his chair, studying me with an intensity that made the entire courtroom feel suddenly silent. "Wait," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet rustle of papers and whispered consultations. "Are you the one?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt every eye in the courtroom turn toward me. Max shifted in her chair, clearly as confused as I was by this unexpected development. Serafina's head turned sharply, her expression moving from calculated confidence to genuine surprise. I stared back at Judge Blackthorne, searching his face for some clue about what he meant, what he was asking, why my presence had prompted such a reaction. His question felt loaded with significance I couldn't understand, weighted with implications that reached beyond the simple inheritance dispute we'd come to resolve. "Your Honor," Max said carefully, "I'm not sure I understand the question." But Judge Blackthorne wasn't looking at Max anymore. His entire focus remained fixed on me, as if he was seeing something, or someone, he hadn't expected to encounter in his courtroom. The silence stretched longer, becoming uncomfortable, pregnant with a tension none of us understood. I found my voice, though it came out smaller than I'd intended. "I'm Cordelia Ravencrest, Your Honor. I'm the defendant in this case." He nodded slowly, still studying my face with that same intense focus. "Yes," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Yes, you are." Serafina's lead attorney cleared his throat, clearly as bewildered by this exchange as the rest of us. "Your Honor, if we could proceed with the hearing." Judge Blackthorne blinked, seeming to remember where he was and what was happening around him. He straightened in his chair, shuffling his papers with movements that suggested he was trying to regain his professional composure. "Of course," he said, though his voice still carried traces of whatever had surprised him. "We'll proceed with opening statements. Counselor Westbrook, you may begin." Serafina's attorney stood and launched into his prepared remarks, outlining their case against the validity of grandmother's will. He spoke about undue influence and questionable mental capacity, about a vulnerable elderly woman and a calculating young relative who'd positioned herself to inherit everything. His words were polished and persuasive, delivered with the kind of confidence that came from expensive legal training and extensive preparation, but I found it difficult to focus on his arguments. My attention kept drifting to Judge Blackthorne, who continued to glance in my direction with that same expression of recognition and surprise. Whatever he'd seen when he'd looked at me, whatever had prompted his strange question, it had clearly affected him more than he was letting on. The opening statements continued, with Max delivering our response, a clear, factual presentation of the evidence supporting grandmother's mental competency and the legitimacy of her decision to leave everything to me. She outlined my years of involvement in the family business, my care for grandmother during her illness, and the documented nature of the inheritance decision. Throughout it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted the moment Judge Blackthorne had seen my face. His question, "Are you the one?" echoed in my mind, carrying implications I couldn't grasp but somehow felt were crucial to understanding not just this case, but something much larger about my family and my place in it. When the opening statements concluded, Judge Blackthorne called for a brief recess. As people began filing out of the courtroom, I remained seated, trying to process what had just happened. Max was gathering her papers, making notes about the direction of the opposing counsel's arguments, but I could see she was also puzzled by the judge's unusual behavior. "That was strange," she murmured, leaning closer so our conversation couldn't be overheard. "I've appeared before Judge Blackthorne dozens of times, and I've never seen him react to a litigant like that." "What do you think he meant?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "When he asked if I was the one what?" Max shook her head. "I have no idea, but it suggests he knows something about you or your family that we weren't expecting. We should be prepared for that to affect how this case proceeds." Across the courtroom, I could see Serafina in intense conversation with her legal team. She kept glancing in my direction, her expression suggesting she was as confused by the judge's reaction as we were. Whatever she'd expected from this hearing, it clearly wasn't the kind of recognition Judge Blackthorne had shown upon seeing me. The recess stretched longer than expected, giving me time to think about the strange turn the morning had taken. I'd spent weeks preparing for this hearing, reviewing every document, practicing answers to anticipated questions, steeling myself for the emotional challenge of facing my mother across a courtroom. But nothing had prepared me for the possibility that there were elements to this situation I didn't understand, secrets that even my careful preparation hadn't uncovered. When we reconvened, Judge Blackthorne seemed to have regained his professional composure, but I could still sense an undercurrent of something, tension perhaps, or anticipation, that hadn't been there at the beginning of the hearing. The first witness was called, an expert in geriatric psychology who'd been hired by Serafina's team to testify about grandmother's potential mental decline. The testimony was technical and detailed, focusing on medical records and behavioral observations that painted a picture of a woman whose decision-making capacity might have been compromised. It was exactly the kind of expert witness testimony that could sway a judge in an inheritance dispute, the kind of professional opinion that might make my years of close relationship with grandmother seem more like manipulation than genuine care. Max cross-examined skillfully, poking holes in the experts' conclusions and highlighting the limitations of reaching psychological assessments based solely on medical records rather than actual examination. But I could see that the testimony had made an impact, introducing doubt about grandmother's mental state during the crucial period when she'd updated her will. The morning proceeded with additional witnesses and document presentations, each side building their case with methodical precision. Serafina's team painted a picture of deliberate isolation and undue influence, while we countered with evidence of my legitimate involvement in both the family business and grandmother's care. Throughout it all, I remained acutely aware of Judge Blackthorn's occasional glances in my direction. Whatever he'd recognized when he'd first seen me, it hadn't faded with time or professional routine. If anything, his interest seemed to deepen as the hearing progressed, as if each piece of testimony was adding to some larger understanding he was developing. When we broke for lunch, Max suggested we use the time to review our afternoon strategy, but I found myself too distracted to focus on legal preparations. The morning had raised questions I hadn't expected, open possibilities I couldn't yet comprehend. Whatever was happening in this courtroom went beyond a simple inheritance dispute, and I had the unsettling feeling that I was the only person present who didn't understand the full scope of what was at stake. The afternoon session began with testimony from Serafina herself. She took the witness stand with the same confident bearing she'd shown in the lobby, answering her attorney's questions with practiced ease. She spoke about her relationship with grandmother, about her concerns regarding my influence, about her belief that the inheritance was the result of manipulation rather than genuine affection. Listening to her testimony felt surreal. She described a version of events that bore only passing resemblance to reality, painting herself as a concerned daughter who'd been deliberately excluded from her mother's life by a calculating granddaughter. She spoke about attempting to maintain contact with grandmother, about phone calls that went unreturned and invitations that were declined, suggesting that I'd been systematically isolating the elderly woman from her family. The irony was breathtaking. Here was the woman who'd abandoned her 7-year-old daughter, who'd chosen her own freedom over family responsibility, now claiming that she'd been the victim of exclusion. She spoke with apparent sincerity about her love for grandmother, about her shock at learning the contents of the will, about her conviction that something underhanded had influenced the inheritance decision. When Max began her cross-examination, the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop several degrees. Her questions were precise and devastating, methodically exposing the contradictions in Serafina's narrative. She forced my mother to admit the extent of her absence from my childhood, the limited nature of her contact with grandmother over the past 2 decades, the sudden timing of her interest in family relationships coinciding with news of the inheritance. "Mrs. Ravencrest," Max said, her voice carrying the kind of controlled intensity that made experienced litigants nervous, "you testified that you attempted to maintain regular contact with your mother. Can you tell the court about the last time you visited her before her final illness?" Serafina shifted uncomfortably in the witness chair. "I called regularly. We spoke on the phone." "That wasn't my question. When did you last visit her in person?" The pause stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. "It had been some time. I live across the country. Travel is difficult." "How long is some time, Mrs. Ravencrest? 1 year? 2 years? 5 years?" Another pause. Longer this time. Perhaps 3 years, maybe 4. Actually, according to the visitor logs your mother kept, logs that are part of the evidence in this case, your last visit was 6 years ago. 6 years, Mrs. Ravencrest. Does that seem consistent with someone who was trying to maintain a close relationship? The cross-examination continued with similar precision, each question carefully designed to expose the gap between Seraphina's claims and the documented reality of her relationship with grandmother. By the time Max finished, the picture that had emerged was clear. Seraphina had been an absent daughter and grandmother who'd shown renewed interest in family only when there was money involved. But even as I watched my mother's testimony unravel under skilled cross-examination, I remained distracted by Judge Blackthorn's continued attention. His questions to witnesses went beyond standard legal inquiry, probing into details about family history and relationships that seemed to extend beyond the scope of the inheritance dispute. When the afternoon session ended and court was adjourned until the following morning, I felt both exhausted and unsettled. The day had gone better than I dared hope in terms of the legal proceedings. Seraphina's case had significant weaknesses that Max had expertly exposed. But the mystery of Judge Blackthorn's reaction to me remained unsolved, hanging over everything like a question mark that refused to resolve itself. As we gathered our papers and prepared to leave, Max turned to me with an expression that mixed satisfaction with concern. "We had a good day," she said, "but there's something happening here that I don't understand. Judge Blackthorn's behavior is highly unusual. Whatever he thinks he recognizes about you, it's affecting how he's handling this case." I nodded, feeling the weight of that observation. "Do you think it will help or hurt us?" "I honestly don't know, but I think we need to be prepared for tomorrow to bring surprises we haven't anticipated." As we left the courthouse, I caught sight of Seraphina standing near the main entrance, surrounded by her legal team, in what appeared to be an intense discussion. She looked frustrated and tired, perhaps beginning to realize that her carefully planned legal strategy wasn't proceeding as smoothly as she'd expected. For a moment, our eyes met again across the courthouse steps. This time, there was no performance in her expression, no calculated drama. Instead, I saw something that looked almost like vulnerability, a crack in the polished facade she'd maintained throughout the day. But then the moment passed, and she turned away, disappearing into a waiting car with her attorneys. I stood there watching until the vehicle disappeared into traffic, wondering if I'd imagined that brief glimpse of the woman who'd once been my mother before she'd chosen everything else over the family she'd left behind. The drive home took me through the familiar streets of the town where I'd grown up, past the textile mills and shops that form the backbone of our local economy. Ravencrest Textiles had been part of this community for 3 generations, providing jobs and stability through economic changes that had devastated other areas. The weight of that responsibility had become even heavier since grandmother's death, as I'd struggled to maintain operations while fighting a legal battle that threatened everything we'd built. The family estate sat on 12 acres outside of town, surrounded by the kind of mature trees and carefully maintained gardens that spoke to generations of careful stewardship. I'd spent my childhood exploring these grounds, building tree houses and fairy gardens under grandmother's patient supervision. Every corner held memories of the woman who'd raised me, who'd taught me to see beauty in both business success and quiet domestic moments. Inside the house, evidence of grandmother's presence remained everywhere. Her reading glasses still sat on the kitchen table where she'd left them while reviewing the morning paper. Her favorite coffee mug waited in the dish drainer, cleaned but unused since her death. Her books filled the shelves in the library, each one chosen with care, and many bearing handwritten notes in the margins that revealed her thoughts and reactions. I'd kept everything exactly as she'd left it, partly because I found comfort in the familiar arrangements, but also because changing anything felt like accepting the finality of her absence. This house had been my refuge during childhood, the place where I'd learned that family could mean safety and unconditional love rather than abandonment and disappointment. Now it was the center of a legal battle that threatened to take away not just physical possessions, but the very foundation of the life I'd built. Serafina's lawsuit wasn't just about money or property, it was about erasing the family structure that had given my life meaning, about reducing my relationship with grandmother to a calculated scheme for financial gain. That evening, I sat in grandmother's favorite chair in the library, surrounded by books she'd collected over a lifetime of careful reading and thoughtful acquisition. I'd been avoiding this room since her death, finding it too painful to occupy the space where we'd spent countless hours discussing literature, business, and life. But tonight, with the first day of the hearing behind me and Judge Blackthorn's mysterious recognition still puzzling me, I needed to feel close to the woman who'd understood me better than anyone else ever had. I pulled out the letter grandmother had written to me just before she died, the one she'd sealed and asked me not to read until after the funeral. I'd opened it 3 months ago, during the darkest period of grief and legal preparation, and its contents had provided both comfort and additional mystery. My dearest Cordelia, it began in her careful handwriting, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're facing challenges I hoped you'd never have to endure. I know Serafina will contest the will. I know she'll claim that you manipulated me, or that I wasn't competent to make my own decisions. These accusations will hurt you because they pervert the truth of our relationship, but don't let them change how you see yourself or the love we shared. The letter went on to detail her reasons for leaving everything to me, her confidence in my ability to continue the family business, and her hope that I'd find happiness even in the midst of legal battles. But it was the final paragraph that had puzzled me since I'd first read it. There are things about our family history that I never told you, secrets that I thought were buried with the past. If circumstances become difficult, if you find yourself facing challenges that seem insurmountable, look for answers in the place where we used to search for fairy gold. Some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud, but too important to die with their keepers. I'd read those words dozens of times over the past 3 months, trying to understand what she meant by the place where we used to search for fairy gold. As a child, I'd spent hours with her in the garden, looking for sparkles of mica in the soil that she'd playfully called fairy gold. But I'd searched that garden thoroughly after reading the letter, finding nothing more significant than fond memories and well-tended plants. Now, with Judge Blackthorn's strange recognition adding new mystery to an already complicated situation, I wondered if I'd missed something important in my search for whatever grandmother had wanted me to find. The legal battle was proceeding as expected, but there were clearly elements to this story that I didn't understand, connections and histories that remained hidden despite my careful preparation. The house felt larger and quieter than usual that night, filled with shadows that seemed to hold secrets I couldn't access. I'd grown up here feeling secure and loved, but tonight I was acutely aware of how much I still didn't know about my family's past. Grandmother had been generous with stories about the textile business and her own childhood, but there had always been gaps in the narrative, years in relationships that she'd mentioned only briefly, or not at all. Tomorrow would bring the second day of the hearing, more testimony and evidence, more chances for both sides to make their case. But I had the growing certainty that the real resolution to this conflict lay not in legal arguments or documented evidence, but in understanding whatever Judge Blackthorne had recognized when he'd looked at me, whatever truth Grandmother had hidden in her cryptic final message. I fell asleep in her chair that night, surrounded by her books and the lingering scent of her favorite perfume, dreaming of fairy gold and courtroom recognitions and secrets that shifted like shadows every time I tried to grasp them. When I woke just before dawn, stiff from sleeping in the chair but oddly refreshed, I knew that today would bring answers to questions I was only beginning to understand how to ask. The morning light filtering through the library windows seemed different somehow, charged with possibility and revelation. I made coffee in Grandmother's kitchen, using her favorite mug for the first time since her death, and found myself drawn back to her letter. The phrase about fairy gold haunted me, carrying significance I couldn't quite grasp, but felt hovering just beyond my understanding. As I prepared for the second day of hearings, I decided to take a different route through the garden, one that would lead me past the old oak tree, where Grandmother and I had spent countless afternoons searching for those elusive sparkles in the soil. The morning dew made everything glisten, and for a moment I was 7 years old again, convinced that magic could be found if you just knew where to look. That's when I saw it, something I'd missed in all my previous searches. Carved into the bark of the oak tree, weathered by decades but still visible, were 3 initials, EB plus TR. The carving was old, made when the tree was smaller, the bark thinner. Below the initials, almost hidden by the natural growth of the wood, was a small heart with what looked like a date, 1967. My hands trembled as I traced the letters. EB and TR, Erasmus Blackthorne and Thessaly Ravencrest. Judge Blackthorne and my grandmother had known each other well enough for someone to carve their initials into a tree on our family property 57 years ago. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Judge Blackthorne's reaction to seeing me in the courtroom, his strange question about whether I was the one, suddenly made terrible sense. He hadn't been recognizing me. He'd been recognizing her, seeing Grandmother's features in my face, remembering a relationship that had existed decades before I was born. I stood there in the garden, surrounded by the roses Grandmother had tended with such care, understanding that everything I'd believed about my family was about to change again. The inheritance dispute was complicated enough without adding a romantic connection between the presiding judge and the woman whose will was being contested. But as I stared at those weathered initials, I realized that the connection might be even more significant than a simple conflict of interest. The drive to the courthouse passed in a blur of racing thoughts and growing certainty that today's proceedings would be unlike anything I'd anticipated. Max was waiting for me in the lobby, reviewing her notes for our planned testimony, but I could barely focus on her strategic preparations. The discovery in the garden had shifted my entire understanding of what was at stake in this courtroom. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Max observed as we made our way to the courtroom. "Are you ready for this?" I nodded, though ready seemed inadequate for what I was beginning to suspect lay ahead. "Max, I need to ask you something. How long has Judge Blackthorne been on the bench here?" "About 15 years, why?" "And before that? Where was he practicing law?" Max paused, clearly puzzled by the direction of my questions. "He was in private practice for many years, specializing in family law. Why are you asking about this now?" Before I could answer, the courtroom doors opened and we filed inside for the second day of proceedings. Serafina was already seated with her legal team, looking more composed than she had the previous afternoon. Whatever discussion they'd had after court yesterday had apparently resulted in a refined strategy, because her attorneys were arranging their materials with renewed confidence. Judge Blackthorne entered the courtroom with the same measured dignity he'd shown the day before, but this time I was watching for signs of recognition, clues about the connection I'd discovered in the garden. When his eyes found mine, I saw something there that I hadn't noticed before. Not just surprise, but pain, and something that looked remarkably like longing. "We'll continue with witness testimony," he announced, settling into his chair behind the bench. "I believe the defense has witnesses to present." Max stood and called our first witness, a longtime employee of Ravencrest Textiles, who testified about my competence and dedication to the business. The testimony was straightforward and supportive, establishing my legitimate role in the company's operations and my close working relationship with grandmother during her final years. But I found it difficult to concentrate on the proceedings. My attention kept drifting to Judge Blackthorne, studying his reactions, looking for confirmation of what I'd discovered in the garden. Every time he looked in my direction, I saw that same expression of recognition, mixed with something deeper, something that suggested our connection was more personal than professional. When court recessed for lunch, I made an excuse to Max about needing some air and found myself walking through the courthouse corridors, looking for anything that might provide additional clues about Judge Blackthorne's history. The building was older than I'd realized, with portraits of former judges lining the walls and display cases showing the evolution of local legal practice over the decades. In one of the display cases, I found what I was looking for, a photograph from 1973 showing the local bar association's annual dinner. The image was black and white, slightly faded, but clear enough to show a young Erasmus Blackthorne standing next to a woman whose face was immediately familiar, despite the passage of nearly 50 years. Grandmother, elegant in a formal gown, looking up at him with an expression of unmistakable affection. The caption below the photograph identified them as Mr. Erasmus Blackthorne and Miss Thessaly Ravencrest, 1973 Bar Association Annual Dinner. I stared at the image, seeing not just confirmation of their connection, but evidence of something deeper. The way they stood together, the way she looked at him, suggested a relationship that went beyond casual acquaintance. "I wondered when you'd find that." I turned to find Judge Blackthorne standing behind me, his judicial robes replaced with a simple suit, his expression vulnerable in a way that transformed his entire demeanor. Away from the formal authority of the courtroom, he looked older, more human, weighted with decades of memories and regrets. "Your Honor," I began, but he held up a hand to stop me. "Not here. Not while the case is ongoing." He paused, studying my face with the same intensity he'd shown in the courtroom. "But after today's proceedings are concluded, I think you deserve some answers. Your grandmother she was very important to me once." The afternoon session proceeded with additional witness testimony and document presentation, but the discovery of Judge Blackthorn's connection to grandmother had fundamentally altered my understanding of what was happening. Every ruling, every question, every moment of attention from the bench now carried additional weight, layered with personal history I was only beginning to understand. Serafina's attorneys presented their final arguments with renewed vigor, painting a picture of undue influence and questionable mental capacity that felt even more insulting given what I'd learned about grandmother's past relationships and careful decision-making. They spoke about her as if she'd been a naive victim, rather than a woman who'd navigated complex personal and professional relationships with intelligence and grace. When Max delivered our closing argument, she focused on the documented evidence of grandmother's competency and the legitimacy of my role in both her life and the family business. Her presentation was thorough and persuasive, systematically dismantling the claims of manipulation and fraud that formed the foundation of Serafina's case. But throughout the proceedings, I remained acutely aware of Judge Blackthorn's attention, of the weight of secrets that hung over the courtroom like an unresolved cord waiting for resolution. Whatever the legal outcome of this hearing, I knew that the real revelation was yet to come. When the formal proceedings concluded and Judge Blackthorn announced that he would render his decision the following morning, the courtroom began to empty with the usual bustle of lawyers packing briefcases and litigants preparing for uncertain evenings. But Judge Blackthorn caught my eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod toward his chambers. "Go," Max said quietly, having noticed the exchange. "I'll handle the procedural matters. You need to find out what this is about." Judge Blackthorn's chambers were smaller and more personal than I'd expected, filled with law books and family photographs that spoke to a life lived both professionally and privately. He'd removed his judicial robes, appearing more human in his simple shirt and tie, more like the young man I'd seen in that 1973 photograph. "Please, sit," he said, indicating a leather chair across from his desk. "I've been dreading this conversation for 3 years, ever since Thessaly died. I knew that eventually circumstances would bring us together." I settled into the chair, studying his face for clues about what was coming. "You loved her?" It wasn't a question, and he didn't treat it as one. "I did, more than I've ever loved anyone, before or since." He leaned back in his chair, his expression distant with memory. "We met in law school, both of us young and idealistic, convinced we could change the world through legal practice. She was brilliant, beautiful, more passionate about justice than anyone I'd ever known." "What happened?" His smile was sad, weighted with decades of regret. "Life happened. Her family's textile business was struggling, needed someone to take over operations. My practice was just getting established here. We had choices to make about our futures, and we made different ones. I thought about the carved initials in the oak tree, about the photograph of them together at the Bar Association dinner. But you stayed in touch for a while. She married your grandfather, started a family, threw herself into building the textile business into something sustainable. I established my practice, eventually became a judge, built what most people would consider a successful life. He paused, studying his hands, but we never quite let go of each other completely. The implications of what he was telling me began to settle into clarity. Judge Blackthorne, if you had a personal relationship with my grandmother, shouldn't you recuse yourself from this case? He nodded slowly. Under normal circumstances, absolutely. But Thessaly anticipated this situation. She knew Serafina would contest the will, knew that eventually the case would likely end up in my courtroom. She asked me to hear it, to make sure that the truth came out completely. What truth? Judge Blackthorne opened his desk drawer and withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, with my name written on the front in grandmother's familiar handwriting. She left this with me 20 years ago, with instructions to give it to you only if circumstances required complete honesty about our family's history. My hands shook as I accepted the envelope. The paper was heavy, expensive, the kind grandmother had used for important correspondence. I could feel multiple pages inside, weighted with significance I wasn't sure I was prepared to understand. Before you read that, Judge Blackthorne said gently, you should know that your grandmother was the most honorable person I've ever known. Whatever secrets you're about to discover, they don't diminish that truth. I opened the envelope carefully, unfolding 3 pages of grandmother's careful handwriting. The first lines made my breath catch in my throat. My dearest Cordelia, if you're reading this letter, then Erasmus has determined that you need to know the complete truth about our family's history. I've kept these secrets for your entire life, not out of shame, but out of a desire to protect you from complications you shouldn't have to bear. The letter continued with revelations that reframed everything I'd believed about my identity. Your mother, Serafina, is not my only child. I had another daughter, born in 1958, during my relationship with Erasmus, before either of us was married. We were young, unmarried, and facing social pressures that made raising a child together impossible. We made the difficult decision to place her for adoption with a family who could provide the stability we couldn't offer. I stopped reading, the words blurring as I tried to process what grandmother was telling me. Another daughter, an aunt I'd never known existed, a secret that had been kept for over 60 years. Judge Blackthorne's voice was gentle but steady. Her name was Viviana Ravenwood. She was adopted by the Ravenwood family, grew up about 3 hours from here, became a social worker specializing in family reunification. She never knew about her birth parents, never searched for us, apparently content with the family that raised her. Was? I managed to ask. She died 10 years ago, cancer. But Cordelia. He paused, his expression intense with significance. She had a daughter who bears a remarkable resemblance to Thessaly at the same age, a daughter who inherited her mother's passion for justice and her grandmother's intelligence. The pieces began falling into place with stunning clarity. When you saw me in the courtroom, you thought I might be your cousin, Viviana's daughter. When I saw you walk into that courtroom, you looked so much like Thessaly did when she was young that for a moment I thought somehow Viviana's child had found her way to us. He leaned forward, his eyes bright with discovery. But then I realized who you actually were, and everything became even more meaningful. I continued reading grandmother's letter, learning about the years of wondering about their firstborn daughter, the periodic attempts to locate her through private investigators, the discovery of her death and the granddaughter she'd left behind. The final paragraph provided the context I'd been seeking. I never tried to contact Viviana's daughter directly, feeling that such contact should be her choice rather than mine. But I've watched her from a distance, proud of the woman she's become, hoping that someday circumstances might bring our family together. If you're reading this letter, then perhaps that day has come. You have a cousin, Cordelia, a young woman who shares your strength and intelligence, who deserves to know about the family she comes from. Judge Blackthorne handed me another document, this one more recent. Thessaly asked me to investigate your cousin's current situation to make sure she was well and thriving. Her name is Lydia Ravenwood. She's 33 years old, works as a civil rights attorney in the state capitol, recently made partner at a prestigious firm specializing in social justice cases. I stared at the documentation, seeing photographs of a woman who indeed bore a striking resemblance to the old pictures I'd seen of grandmother as a young woman. The same dark hair, the same intelligent eyes, the same determined set to her jaw that I recognized from my own mirror. Does she know about any of this? Not yet. Thessaly wanted that to be your decision if circumstances ever brought this truth to light. Judge Blackthorne gathered the papers, arranging them carefully. But Cordelia, there's something else you need to understand. This secret, this family history, it has direct bearing on your mother's lawsuit. I looked up from the photographs, confused about the connection between a hidden family branch and the inheritance dispute. Thessaly's will wasn't just about leaving you the business and the estate, he explained. It was about ensuring that the family legacy continued through someone who shared her values and commitment to justice. But it was also about making sure that Viviana's daughter, your cousin, eventually learned about her heritage and had the opportunity to claim her place in the family if she chose to. He handed me another document, this one bearing official legal seals. There's a codicil to Thessaly's will that was sealed until circumstances required its disclosure. It establishes a trust fund for Viviana's descendants, money that's been set aside for over 30 years, waiting for the day when contact could be established. The scope of grandmother's planning was breathtaking. She had anticipated not just Serafina's challenge to the inheritance, but the eventual need to reveal family secrets and establish contact with lost relatives. Every decision, every legal document, every carefully worded instruction had been designed to protect family interests while preserving individual choice. The trust fund, I said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. How much? Enough to significantly impact your mother's calculation about the value of contesting the will. The codicil reduces the overall estate by approximately 40%, money that was always intended for Viviana's family but couldn't be distributed until contact was established. The implications were staggering. Serafina's lawsuit was based on claiming the entire estate, but if a significant portion had always been designated for another branch of the family, her potential recovery was much smaller than she'd calculated. More importantly, the existence of the codicil demonstrated grandmother's long-term planning and mental competency in ways that undermined the foundation of the undue influence claims. When will this information be presented to the court? Judge Blackthorne glanced at his watch, his expression serious. Tomorrow morning, when I render my decision. The codicil requires disclosure as part of the final settlement, regardless of the outcome on the main inheritance challenge. I spent that evening in grandmother's library, surrounded by her books and the weight of revelations that had transformed my understanding of family history. The letter from Judge Blackthorn's office had provided contact information for Lydia Ravenwood, including her law firm's address and phone number. For hours, I stared at those details, trying to decide how to approach a cousin I'd never known existed, how to explain a family connection that had been hidden for over 6 decades. The phone call, when I finally made it, was surreal in its ordinariness. Lydia Ravenwood answered with professional efficiency, clearly working late in her office, unprepared for the conversation that was about to reshape her understanding of her own identity. Ms. Ravenwood, my name is Cordelia Ravencrest, and I'm calling about a family matter that's going to sound quite unusual. There was a pause, then a slightly wary response. I'm sorry, I don't recognize the name. Are you sure you have the right person? Your mother was Viviana Ravenwood, born Viviana Blackthorne in 1958, adopted as an infant by the Ravenwood family. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Lydia finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled, professionally neutral, despite the personal nature of the conversation. My mother never knew her birth parents. She died 10 years ago, without ever learning about her biological family. How do you know these details? Because Viviana was my grandmother's daughter, my great-aunt, which makes you my cousin. I took a deep breath, trying to organize thoughts that felt too large for simple explanation. Ms. Ravenwood, I know this is shocking and difficult to process, but there's a family inheritance situation that affects you directly, and you have the right to know about your heritage. The conversation continued for over an hour, with me explaining the inheritance dispute, the secret family history, and the trust fund that had been waiting for her discovery for over 3 decades. Lydia listened with the kind of careful attention I'd expect from an experienced attorney, asking clarifying questions and requesting documentation to support what had to sound like an elaborate fiction. I'll need to verify all of this independently, she said finally, her professional caution evident even through the phone. But if what you're telling me is true, if I really do have family that I never knew about, you do. And tomorrow morning, when the court ruling is announced, you'll officially be notified about the trust fund. But I wanted you to hear about it from family first, not from court documents. The following morning brought crowds to the courthouse larger than anything the previous days had generated. Word had leaked about unusual developments in the Ravencrest inheritance case, drawing spectators and media attention that transformed the normally quiet probate hearing into a public spectacle. Serafina arrived looking confident but tense, clearly anticipating a ruling that would vindicate her claims about grandmother's mental incompetence and my undue influence. Her legal team had their victory statements prepared, their appeals strategy outlined, their conviction evident in every gesture and arrangement. I sat with Max at the defendant's table, holding the sealed documents that would soon transform the entire scope of the case. Judge Blackthorne had explained that the codicil disclosure was mandatory, regardless of his ruling on the main inheritance challenge, but the timing of the revelation would depend on the direction of his decision. When Judge Blackthorne entered the courtroom and called the session to order, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation that extended beyond the immediate parties to the case. This had become more than a simple inheritance dispute. It had become a public examination of family loyalty, elder care, and the complex dynamics that shape how wealth transfers between generations. I've reviewed all the evidence presented in this case, Judge Blackthorne began, his voice carrying easily through the packed courtroom. "I've considered the testimony of expert witnesses, the documentary evidence regarding Mrs. Thessaly Ravencrest's mental capacity, and the claims of undue influence that form the foundation of the plaintiff's challenge to the will." He paused, his gaze moving between the two tables, settling momentarily on me with an expression that conveyed both professional duty and personal understanding. "The evidence presented by the plaintiff fails to demonstrate either mental incapacity or undue influence sufficient to invalidate Mrs. Ravencrest's final will and testament. The defendant's long-standing involvement in the family business, her documented care for the deceased during her final illness, and the clear evidence of Mrs. Ravencrest's continued mental acuity all support the validity of her testamentary decisions." Relief washed over me, but I could see from Judge Blackthorne's expression that the ruling was far from complete. "However," he continued, "there are additional elements to this case that require disclosure under state probate law. Mrs. Ravencrest's will contains a sealed codicil that becomes effective upon the resolution of any inheritance challenges. This codicil establishes significant trust provisions that affect the overall distribution of the estate." Seraphina's head snapped up, her expression shifting from disappointment to alarm as she realized that there were aspects to this case her legal team hadn't anticipated. "The codicil," Judge Blackthorne explained, "establishes a trust fund of approximately $2.7 million for the descendants of Mrs. Ravencrest's eldest daughter, Viviana Ravenwood, who was placed for adoption in 1958. This trust has been funded through careful financial planning over more than 30 years, and its existence demonstrates both Mrs. Ravencrest's long-term mental competency and her commitment to ensuring fair treatment for all branches of her family." The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs and whispered conversations as the implications of this revelation became clear. Seraphina's potential inheritance had just been reduced by nearly half, while a previously unknown family member had been revealed as a significant beneficiary. Ms. Lydia Ravenwood, the granddaughter of Viviana Ravenwood and biological great-granddaughter of Thessaly Ravencrest, has been notified of her inheritance and has legal standing to participate in these proceedings if she chooses to do so. As if summoned by his words, the courtroom doors opened and Lydia Ravenwood entered, accompanied by an attorney, and moving with the kind of confident bearing I recognized from successful legal professionals. She was indeed strikingly similar to the old photographs of grandmother, but seeing her in person made the family resemblance even more remarkable. Seraphina stared at this new arrival with undisguised shock, clearly struggling to process how the case had shifted so dramatically from her expectations. Her legal team was frantically conferring, trying to adjust their strategy to account for revelations they'd had no opportunity to investigate or challenge. "Your Honor," Seraphina's lead attorney said, rising with obvious reluctance, "we request time to review these new developments and their impact on our client's claims." Judge Blackthorne shook his head. "The codicil has been sealed pending resolution of the main inheritance challenge, but its provisions were established over 3 decades ago and have been properly maintained under legal supervision throughout that period. There are no grounds for additional challenges to its validity." He looked around the courtroom, his expression conveying the weight of the moment. "The court finds that Mrs. Thessaly Ravencrest's will is valid and enforceable as written, including all codicils and trust provisions. The inheritance challenge is dismissed, and the estate will be distributed according to the deceased's clearly expressed wishes. The gavel fell with a sound that seemed to echo through the courtroom and through my life, marking the end of not just a legal battle, but an entire chapter of family conflict and hidden history. Serafina sat frozen at the plaintiff's table, clearly struggling to process the magnitude of her defeat and the revelation that the family she'd tried to claim was larger and more complex than she'd ever imagined. As the courtroom began to empty, Lydia Ravenwood approached our table with the kind of directness I'd already learned to associate with family traits. Up close, the resemblance to grandmother was even more striking, not just in physical features, but in the intelligent alertness of her expression. "Cordelia Ravencrest," she said, extending her hand, "I believe we're cousins." The handshake became an embrace, spontaneous and natural, despite the strangeness of meeting family for the first time as adults. Standing there, holding my newly discovered cousin, I felt grandmother's presence as clearly as if she'd been standing beside us, orchestrating this reunion with the same careful planning she'd applied to every important aspect of her life. "She would have loved this moment," I said, and Lydia nodded as if she understood exactly what I meant, despite never having met the woman who'd connected us. Serafina approached us hesitantly, her legal team having departed with the efficiency of professionals distancing themselves from a lost cause. For the first time since I'd seen her in the courthouse lobby, she looked genuinely uncertain, stripped of the confident performance she'd maintained throughout the proceedings. "Cordelia," she said, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in 31 years, "I owe you an apology." The words hung between us, weighted with decades of abandonment and recent months of legal warfare. I studied her face, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus calculated strategy, trying to determine whether this was another performance or something more authentic. "You do," I agreed, not making it easy for her. "But apologies don't erase 24 years of absence or the last year of trying to destroy everything grandmother built." She nodded, accepting the harsh assessment without argument. "I know, I can't undo any of that, but I want you to know that when I started this lawsuit, I genuinely believed you'd manipulated her, that she couldn't have been thinking clearly when she left everything to someone so young. And now I understand that you were the daughter she deserved, the one who stayed and built something meaningful with her guidance." Serafina's voice caught slightly, revealing emotion I hadn't expected. "I was never that daughter. I was too selfish, too focused on my own dreams, too convinced that family was something that would wait while I pursued other things." Lydia had been listening to this exchange with the kind of professional attention I was learning to recognize as characteristic of family traits. "What will you do now?" she asked Serafina gently. "I don't know. Start over, I suppose. Try to figure out how to build a life that doesn't depend on taking things away from other people." She looked at me with something that might have been hope. "Cordelia, I know I don't have the right to ask for anything from you, but would it be possible someday to try to know each other again? Not as mother and daughter necessarily, but as people who share some history?" The request surprised me with its modesty, its acknowledgement of the damage that couldn't be undone, while suggesting the possibility of something new being constructed from the ruins. I thought about grandmother's capacity for forgiveness, her ability to maintain love for a daughter who disappointed her while never allowing that disappointment to compromise her own integrity. Maybe, I said finally, but it would have to be honest, and it would have to be gradual, and it would have to be on terms that respect what's already been built rather than trying to tear it down. She nodded eagerly, relief evident in her expression. Whatever terms you think are fair, I just don't want to lose the chance entirely. As we left the courthouse that afternoon, I found myself walking between my newfound cousin and my long-lost mother, feeling the strange weight of family relationships that had been broken and discovered and tentatively rebuilt all in the span of a few days. The inheritance was secure, the business would continue, and the legacy grandmother had built would pass forward as she'd intended. But more than that, the secrets she'd kept and the careful planning she'd done had created opportunities for connection and understanding that reached beyond simple financial inheritance. Lydia would learn about the family she'd never known, inheriting not just money, but belonging. Serafina would have the chance to rebuild relationships she'd abandoned if she proved capable of the sustained effort such rebuilding required. And I would continue to steward the textile business and the family legacy, but now with the knowledge that family was both more complicated and more resilient than I'd ever understood. The fairy gold grandmother had encouraged me to search for hadn't been hidden treasure after all. It had been the possibility of family connection surviving even the most difficult circumstances, waiting to be discovered when the time was right for revelation. The letter grandmother had left in Judge Blackthorn's care had contained one final paragraph that I'd read privately after the court proceedings concluded. Remember, my dearest Cordelia, that family is not just about blood or inheritance or shared history. It's about the choice to see the best in each other, to forgive what needs forgiving, and to build something together that's stronger than what any of us could create alone. You've always had that gift, that ability to see possibility where others see only problems. Use it wisely, and our family will continue to grow in ways I can only imagine. Standing in the courthouse parking lot that afternoon, surrounded by people who'd been strangers or enemies just days before, but who now represented the complex, imperfect, hopeful reality of family, I understood finally what grandmother had been preparing me for all along. Not just the inheritance of money or property, but the inheritance of choice, the ability to transform conflict into connection, secrets into understanding, and isolation into belonging. The fairy gold had been there all along, waiting not to be found, but to be created through the alchemy of forgiveness, honesty, and the courage to believe that even the most broken relationships could be transformed into something precious if handled with enough care and patience.